Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Where could Fenton Hardy, Frank and Joe's father, have gone? He was last seen in the vicinity of the deserted old Polucca place. So Frank and Joe and several of their chums decide to go explore the whole house, just in case he may be there. What a surprise they have when they find the old house tidied up and seemingly inhabited by some renters. And not only that, but they find a clue that makes them suspect Fenton Hardy may have been hurt. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. The Hardy Boys in the House on the Cliff. Chapter 11. The Cap on the Peg. Next morning, the searching party set out. Jerry Gilroy had not got over the scare he had received on the remarkable Saturday of the boys' first visit to the house on the cliff, and he did not show up. But Chet Morton and Biff Hooper appeared, with Phil Cohen and Tony Preto, two more of the Hardy Boys' chums at the Bayport High School. Chet had his motorcycle, and the party left the Hardy home shortly after breakfast, each machine carrying two. Before they left, Frank explained the situation fully to the others. "We know that Dad was last seen near the Polucca place, and we have every reason to believe that he left here with the intention of searching the house. He hasn't shown up since, and no person has seen him, so there may have been foul play." "If there's any trace of him around the Polucca place, we'll find it," declared Chet. "It'll take a mighty lively ghost to scare us away this time." The three motorcycles went out of Bayport, past the Tower Mansion, and sped along the shore road. There was little talk among the boys. Each realized that this was not a pleasure outing, but a serious mission, and each recognized the importance of it. The Hardy Boys had every confidence in their companions. Chet and Biff, they knew, would not be as easily frightened on this occasion, and as for Phil and Tony, they were noted at school for their fearless, at times even reckless dispositions. They passed the Kane farmhouse, nestling among the trees, and at last came in sight of the gloomy cliff that rose from Barmet Bay, and at the summit of which perched the rambling stone house where the miser, Felix Polucca, had met his death. "Lonely-looking place, isn't it?" remarked Phil, who was sharing Frank's motorcycle. "It was an ideal place for a murder. When Felix Polucca lived there, I doubt if he had more than 2 or 3 visitors in a year. How did he get his food and supplies? He used to drive into the city about once a week in a rattly old buggy, with a horse that must have come out of the ark. The poor animal looked as if it hadn't had a square meal in a lifetime. Polucca must have been a little bit crazy. How he lived alone up there all the time, nobody could understand. He worked hard enough, and he made the farm pay. No one could drive a better bargain when it came to selling his hay and grain." Phil looked with interest at the old gray house that could be seen more clearly now that they were approaching it. When they were still some distance from the lane, however, Frank brought his motorcycle to a stop and signaled to the others to do likewise. "What's the idea?" Chet asked. "We better sneak up on the place quietly. If we go any farther, they'll hear the motorcycles. That is, if there is anyone at the place. We'll leave them here under the trees and go on foot." The motorcycles were accordingly hidden in a clump of bushes beside the road, and the 6 boys went on toward the lane. "We'll separate here," Frank decided. 3 of us will take one side of the lane, and the rest will take the other side. Keep to the bushes as much as possible. And when we get near the house, lay low for a while and watch the place. When I whistle, we can come out from under cover and go on up to the house." "That's a good plan," approved Tony. "Joe and Biff and I will go on the left side of the road." "Good. Chet and Phil and I will take the other side. Remember to keep out of sight of the house as much as possible." The boys entered the lane, then separated, according to the agreement they had made. One group plunged into the weeds and undergrowth at the edge of the lane on one side, while the others pushed into the bushes at the opposite side. In a few minutes, each group was lost to view, and only an occasional snapping and crackling of branches indicated their presence in the heavy undergrowth that flanked the lane. Frank advanced cautiously. The brushwood was much deeper than he had anticipated, and they made slow progress, for he was desirous of creeping up on the house with as little noise as possible. The undergrowth was thick and hampered their movements. They made their way forward step by step, keeping well in from the lane, and after about 10 minutes, Frank raised his hand as a warning to the others. Through the dense thickets, he had caught a glimpse of the house. They went on cautiously until they reached the edge of the bushes, and there they crouched behind the screen of leaves, peeping out at the gloomy old stone building in the clearing. But at the first glance, an expression of surprise crossed Frank's face. The Polucca house was evidently occupied. The weeds that had overgrown the yard on their last visit had been completely cleared away. The grass had been cut, and the tumble-down fence had been repaired. The gate, which had been hanging by only one hinge, had been fixed, and the grass along the pathway had been trimmed. A similar change had overtaken the house. There was glass in all the windows, and the boards had been removed. The front door had been repaired, and the steps had been mended. Smoke was rising from the kitchen chimney. "There must be someone living here," whispered Chet. Frank was puzzled. He had not heard that anyone had taken the Polucca house. On account of the unenviable fame of the place, it was hardly likely that a new tenant could move in without arousing considerable comment in Bayport. But this had evidently happened. For a while the boys remained at the edge of the bushes watching the place. Then they saw a woman come out to the clothesline at the back of the house. She carried a basket of clothes, and these she began hanging up on the line. Shortly afterward, a man came out, strode across the yard to the woodshed, and began chopping wood. The boys looked at one another in consternation. They had expected to find the same sinister and deserted place they had visited previously. Instead, they had arrived on a scene of domestic peace and comfort. They could not understand it. "Not much use staying and hiding," whispered Frank. "Let's get together and walk right up and question these people." He gave a low whistle, then emerged from the bushes into the lane. His companions followed. In a short time they were joined by Joe and the other boys. All were deeply puzzled by the remarkable change that had come over the Polucca place. "This beats anything I ever heard of," declared Joe. "It looks as if some farmer has taken the place. But it's queer we hadn't heard of it. Everybody in Bayport would be talking about it if they knew someone had nerve enough to take over the Polucca farm." "I'm not satisfied yet," Frank said. "We'll go up and question these people." Accordingly, the 6 boys walked boldly out of the lane and across the yard. The man in the woodshed saw them first and put down his axe, staring at them with an expression of annoyance on his face. The woman at the clothesline heard their footsteps and turned, facing them, her hands upon her hips. She was hard-faced and tight-lipped, with gaunt features. She was not prepossessing, and her untidy garb did not impress the boys favorably. "What do you want?" demanded the man, emerging from the woodshed. He was short and thin with close-cropped hair, and he was in need of a shave. He had narrow eyes under coarse black brows. His manner was far from polite as he advanced upon the boys. At the same time, another man came out of the kitchen and stood on the steps. He was stout and red-haired and had a thick mustache. As he stood there in his shirt-sleeves, he glared pugnaciously at the sextet.
"Yeah, what's the big idea?" he asked.
"We didn't know anyone was living here," explained Frank, edging over to the kitchen door. He wanted to get a look inside the house if possible.
"Well, there is," said the red-haired man. "We're living here now, and I can't see that's any of your business. What are you snooping around here for?"
"We aren't snooping," said Frank quietly. "We are looking for a man who has disappeared from Bayport."
"Huh," grunted the woman. "What makes you think he might be around here?" asked the red-headed man.
"He was last seen in this neighborhood."
"What's his name?"
"Hardy."
"What does he look like?"
"Tall and dark. He was wearing a gray suit and a gray cap."
"Ain't nobody been around here since we moved in," said the red-haired man gruffly.
"No, we didn't see him," snapped the woman. "You boys had better go look somewhere else." There was nothing to be gained by arguing with the unsociable trio, so the boys started to leave. But Frank, who had edged close to the open door during the course of the conversation, had glanced into the kitchen, and something had caught his eye. It was a gray cap hanging on a peg. Chapter 12. Pointed Questions. Frank thought quickly. He must ascertain the truth. The cap, he was almost sure, was the one his father had worn on the morning he had left home. But he wanted to look at it closely, because he knew he might be mistaken, and that it would not do to make any accusations unless he were sure of his ground. "I'm very thirsty," he said quickly. "Do you mind if I have a drink?" Redhead and the woman looked at one another without enthusiasm. It was plain that they wished to get rid of their visitors as soon as possible. But they could not refuse such an innocent and reasonable request.
"Come into the kitchen,"
said Redhead grudgingly. This was just what Frank wanted. He followed the man into the kitchen of the Polucca place. Redhead pointed to a water tap. A dipper was hanging from a nail nearby.
"Go ahead," he grunted.
Frank went over to the tap, and as he did so he passed the cap on the peg. He took a swift look at the cap. He had made no mistake. It was his father's. Then he received a shock that almost stunned him. For a second he almost stopped in his tracks, but then he recollected himself and moved mechanically on toward the tap. He had seen blood-stains. On the lower edge of the cap were 3 large stains, reddish in color. They could have been made by nothing but blood. In a daze, Frank turned on the water, filled the dipper, and drank. At last he turned away, conscious that Redhead had been eyeing him carefully all the time. "Thanks," he said, and again cast a glance at the peg. The cap was gone! Redhead had undoubtedly snatched it away and hidden it. Frank gave no sign that he noticed anything amiss, and walked out of the kitchen into the yard, where he rejoined the others. "I guess we may as well be going," he said. "You might as well," snapped the woman. "There's been no strangers around here." "We're sorry we troubled you," said Joe. "Goodbye." Redhead grunted a curt farewell. The woman and the other man said nothing, as the boys turned away and retraced their steps out to the lane. For a while they walked on in silence, and then, when they were out of sight of the house, Frank turned to the others. "Do you know why I went into the kitchen?" he asked. "Why?" they demanded eagerly, and Joe put in, "I thought there was something fishy about the way you asked for that drink. What did you see?" "I saw Dad's cap hanging on a peg." This caused an immediate sensation.
Phil Cohen whistled in amazement. Then he has been here. They were lying. Are you sure it was Dad's cap? Asked Joe. Positive. I'd recognize it anywhere. And more than that, there were blood stains on it. Blood stains? Frank nodded. The boys looked at one another in silence. This is serious, declared Joe finally. We can't let them get away with this. I'll say we can't, agreed Chet. Let's go back. I was going to argue it out right then and there, but I thought I'd better tell the rest of you first, so that you'd know what it was all about, Frank explained. He may have been... Joe left the sentence unfinished. He may have been murdered, said Frank firmly, and we're going to find out about it. What do you think we'd better do? I think we'd better go back and tell them we saw that cap, and ask how it got there. That'll force a showdown. They don't like us too well as it is, so we won't have to be over-polite to them. The boys held a council, and it was unanimously agreed that the matter should not be dropped. Each was of the opinion that the trio now occupying the house on the cliff were far from savory, and that the fact of Fenton Hardy's cat being seen in the kitchen was a clue of first-rate importance. He snatched the cap away when my back was turned, went on Frank. That shows there's something wrong, Chet affirmed. We'll go back and tackle him right away. No time like the present. Let's go. The boys accordingly started back down the lane toward the house. When they emerged into the yard again, they found the two men and the woman standing together by the shed, talking earnestly. The boys were almost up to them before the woman caught sight of them and spoke warningly to the red-headed man. "What do you want now?" demanded Redhead, in a surly manner as he advanced. "We want to know about that cap in the kitchen," said Frank firmly. "What cap? There's no cap in there." "There isn't now, but it was there. It's a gray cap, and it was hanging in there when I went in for a drink." "I don't know nothing about no cap," persisted Redhead. "Perhaps you want us to ask the police up to help us find out," put in Tony Preto cheerfully. Redhead glanced meaningly at the woman. The other man stepped forward. "I know the cap he means," he said. "It's mine. What about it?" "It isn't yours, and you know it," declared Frank. "That cap belongs to the man we're looking for." "I tell you it is my cap," snapped the man who had been cutting wood, showing his yellow teeth in a snarl. "Don't tell me I'm lying." Redhead stepped forward diplomatically. "You're mistaken, Klein," he said. "I know the cap they mean. That's the one I found on the road a few days ago." "You found it?" asked Frank incredulously. "Sure, I found it. A gray cap, with blood stains on it." "That's the one. But why did you hide it when I went into the kitchen?" "Well, to tell the truth, them bloodstains made me nervous. I didn't know but what there might be some trouble come of it, so I thought I'd better keep that cap out of sight." "Where did you find it?" Joe demanded. "Oh, about a mile from here." "On the shore road?" "Yep. It was lying right in the middle of the road." "When was this?" "Couple of days ago, just after we moved in here." "Let's see the cap," suggested Chet Morton. "We want to make sure of this." Redhead moved reluctantly toward the kitchen. The woman sniffed. "I don't see why you're making all this fuss about an old cap," she said. "Coming around at this hour of the day, disturbing honest folk." "We're sorry to disturb you, ma'am," said Joe, "but this is a serious matter." Redhead emerged from the house holding the cap in one hand. He tossed it over to the boys. They examined it eagerly. Frank turned back the inside flap, and there he found what he was looking for. The initials F.H., imprinted in indelible ink on the leather band. "It's Dad's cap, all right." "I don't like the look of those bloodstains," said Joe in a low voice. "He must have been badly hurt." To tell the truth, the inside of the cap gave evidence that the wearer had been severely injured, for the bloodstains were of large extent. The boys examined them gravely. "Are you sure you found this on the road?" Frank asked doubtfully. "You don't think I'd lie about it, do you?" "We can't very well contradict you. I don't mind telling you that we're going to turn this over to the police. The man has disappeared, and by the appearance of this cap, he has met with foul play. If you know anything about it, you'd better speak up now." "He doesn't know anything about it!" shrilled the woman angrily. "Go away! Don't bother us! Didn't he tell you he found that cap on the road? Why should he know anything more about it than that?" "We're going to take the cap with us." "Take it!" snapped Redhead. "I don't want it." The boys turned away. Nothing further was to be gained by questioning the trio in the yard, and at any rate, the lads had gained possession of the cap. "We'd better go," said Frank in a low voice. They went back toward the lane. As they entered it, they cast a last glance back at the yard. The woman and the two men were standing just where they had left them. The woman was motionless, her hands on her hips. Redhead was standing with his arms folded, and the other man was leaning on his axe. All three were gazing intently and silently after the departing boys. Chapter 13. A Plan of Attack. Back in Bayport, the boys discussed their visit to the house on the cliff from all angles. None was satisfied with the explanation the red-headed man had given about the presence of the blood-stained cap in the house. "I'm sure he knows more about it than he cares to tell," declared Frank. "The other chap started to claim it at first, and then he stepped in with his story," Chet pointed out. "That's the most suspicious part of it. And then, when I went into the kitchen in the first place, why should he have hidden the cap?" "It's a mighty mysterious thing," Joe said. "The fact that Dad has disappeared, and the fact that there are bloodstains on that cap." "We ought to turn it over to Chief Collig," suggested Phil. The boys looked at one another doubtfully. Chief of Police Collig was a fat, pompous official who had never been blessed by a superabundance of brains. His chief satellite and aide-de-camp was Oscar Smuff, a detective of the Bayport police force. As Chet was fond of remarking, "If you put both their brains together, you'd have enough for a half-wit." "I don't think it would do much good," said Frank, "but it wouldn't do any harm either. Collig might be able to throw a scare into them anyway, if he went up to that house and began asking questions." The boys therefore trooped down to the police station, and after stating their business to the desk sergeant, were admitted to the chief's private office. There they found Chief Collig and Detective Smuff, deep in a game of checkers. "It's your move, Smuff," said the chief. "What is it, boys?" he demanded, looking up. Frank, producing the blood-stained cap, explained how and where it had been found. Smuff, in the meantime, scratched his head diligently for a while, then captured one of his opponent's kings. Chief Collig grunted, whether in disappointment at the loss of the king, or in acknowledgment of the information about the cap, the boys could not say. "So it's Fenton Hardy's cap, eh?" asked the chief. "It's his, all right." "And what do you think has happened to him?" "We don't know. That's what we want you to help find out. But by the look of this cap, we're afraid there's been foul play." "Just a minute, Smuff. Just a minute." The chief contemplated the checkerboard for a few minutes, then made a move. He settled back in his chair. "Now try and beat that," he said, and looked up at the boys again. "What do you want me to do?" he inquired. "Help us find him." The chief regarded them benevolently. "Oh, maybe he'll show up in a day or so." "He's been missing long enough already," protested Joe. "We want you to go up to the Polucca place and question those people. They know more about the affair than they care to tell." "The Polucca place," exclaimed the chief, pursing his lips. "Well, you see, it ain't in the city limits." But Fenton Hardy is a Bayport citizen. What do you think about it, Smuff?
Just a minute. It's my move.
Smuff meditated over the checkerboard for a while, made his move, then looked up judiciously.
To tell you the truth, Chief, he said, I think we'd be just as well staying away from that Polucca place. There's been queer stories about it.
That's what I think, agreed the chief. Do you mean to say that you won't help us look for him? Exclaimed Frank.
Oh, we'll keep our eyes open, the chief promised. But he'll show up all right. He'll show up, don't worry.
He'll never show up if we wait for the Bayport Police Department to get into action, declared Chet warmly.
Is that so?
Said Chief Collig, nettled. Of course, Chief, said Frank smoothly. If you're afraid to go up to the Polucca place just because it's supposed to be haunted, don't bother. We can tell the newspapers that we believe our father has met with foul play, and that you won't bother to look into the matter. But don't let us disturb you at all.
What's this about the newspapers?
Demanded the chief, getting up from his chair so suddenly that he upset the checkerboard over Smuff's lap.
Don't let this get into the papers.
The chief was constantly afraid of publicity, unless it was of the most favorable nature. The taxpayers mightn't like it, suggested Joe. They pay you to enforce the law, and if they know you're afraid to go up to the Polucca place...
No, said the chief nervously. Who said anything about being afraid of the Polucca place? Can't you take a joke? Of course I'll go up and investigate this. At least I'll send Smuff up. Who, me? Demanded Smuff in alarm. Smuff and me will go up together. I'm doggone sure I won't go up alone, declared Smuff.
Well, as long as we're sure you'll investigate, we won't say anything to the papers, said Frank. And Chief Collig breathed a sigh of relief.
That's fine, he said. Smuff and me will go up there first thing tomorrow morning, and if we find out anything, we'll let you know.
But although Chief Collig and Detective Smuff duly departed from Bayport the next morning, in an exceptionally noisy and decrepit flivver, with Smuff perched nervously at the wheel, they returned before noon with the news that they had been able to discover nothing further regarding Fenton Hardy. They had, they said, called at the house, but the people there had given a reasonable explanation as to the finding of the cap.
Real nice people they were, too, added Chief Collig. The man said he found the cap on the road, and why should he tell a lie about it? So Smuff and me, we came away. Yes, agreed Smuff profoundly. We came away.
In a hurry, suggested Joe sarcastically. Collig and Smuff looked uncomfortable. To tell the truth, they had been so impressed by the fearful stories they had heard about the house on the cliff that they had stayed no longer than was necessary. They had merely asked a few perfunctory questions of Redhead, had received his explanation of the finding of the cap, and had then hastened from the farm as quickly as was consistent with dignity.
We've done our duty, declared Chief Collig. No man can do more.
And with that the boys had to be content. But they were not satisfied. There's some connection between this smuggling outfit and the house on the cliff, declared Frank. This mad Snackley is mixed up in all this, I'm sure. Didn't Mother say he was related to Felix Polucca? Yes, and isn't it likely that he inherited the Polucca farm after the old miser died? Perhaps that's what encouraged him to move his smuggling operations here. Perhaps Snackley was one of the two men we saw at the farm. I wouldn't be surprised, said Frank. But what I'm thinking of is this. Where did those two motorboats come from the day that Jones was shot? We didn't see them out in the bay. They seemed to come right out from under the cliff. Do you mean you think there's a secret harbor in there? There might be. Look at it this way. Snackley was the man who got Jones that day, as he said. Snackley was related to Polucca and may now own the farm. Snackley has been smuggling in Barmet Bay from some base that the government men have been unable to find. Perhaps that base is the Polucca farm. But it's on top of the cliff. There may be a secret passage from the house to some hidden harbor at the foot of the cliff. Gosh, Frank, it sounds reasonable. And perhaps that explains why the kidnappers got away with Jones so quickly that day. If they left the Kane farmhouse just a little while before we did, we should have been able to get within sight of them anyway. But we didn't. You mean they turned in at the Polucca place? Why not? Probably Jones is hidden there right now. That is, if they haven't killed him, he added hesitatingly. But what could have happened to Dad? That's what we're going to find out. What do you say to asking Tony if his father will lend us his motorboat and let us investigate the foot of that cliff? What do you expect to find? We'll find out if there's any place where motorboats could be hidden. And if we get any information, we can turn it over to the government officials and have the Polucca place raided. Then we'll get some satisfaction out of it anyway, and perhaps find out what happened to Dad.
Chapter 14. Private Property. The Hardy boys explained their plan to Tony Preto,
who promised to ask his father about the motorboat, provided they allowed him to go with them. I wouldn't miss it for anything, he said. You let me come along on this trip with you, and I'll see that we get the boat. We wouldn't go anywhere without you, Tony, promised Frank. I'll have the boat tomorrow afternoon. Be at the boathouse. Tony was as good as his word. When Frank and Joe appeared at the little boathouse, one of a long row of ramshackle buildings along the shore next afternoon, they found Tony, clad in a greasy suit of overalls, tinkering with the engine. He was of a mechanical turn of mind, and could never see an engine of any kind without investigating its most intricate machinery. She'll run as smoothly as a sewing machine, he declared, looking up. We can start any time. Your father let you have the boat, all right. You bet. I told him it was to help find your father, and he was almost going to quit work and come along with us. The boys got into the motorboat, which was a rangy, powerful craft with graceful lines, and the engine was soon roaring. The boat, which was called the Napoli, in honor of Mr. Preto's birthplace in Italy, moved slowly out into the waters of the bay, and then gathered speed as it headed toward the gloomy cliffs at the northern extremity of Barmet Bay. It was already late in the afternoon. The sky was overcast, and the bay was rough. The salt spray dashed over the bows of the Napoli as it plunged on through the breakers. Bayport soon became a smoky haze on the hillside. The boys could see the white line of the shore road rising and falling on the coast to the north, and at last they came within sight of the Kane farm, nestled among the trees. The cliff upon which the Polucca place stood was stark and sheer against the background of ocean and sky, and at the top they could see the grove of trees and the roof and chimneys of the haunted house. Lonely-looking place, remarked Joe. Pretty steep cliff, Tony observed. I can't see how anyone could make his way up and down that slope to get to the house. That's just why nobody has thought of the possibility of the place as a smuggling base, said Frank. It doesn't look possible. But perhaps when we look around, we'll find that things are different. Tony steered the boat closer in toward the shore, so that it would not be visible from the Polucca place. Then he slackened speed, so that the roar of the engine would not be so noticeable, and the craft made its way along toward the bottom of the cliff. There were currents here that demanded skillful navigation, but Tony brought the Napoli through them easily, and at last the boat was surging along close to the face of the cliff. The boys scanned the formidable wall of rock eagerly. It was scarred and seamed, and at the base had been eaten away by the battering of the waves. Time passed, and there was no indication of a path, and the lads were disappointed. The cliff jutted up out of very deep water and rose to a great height. From the boat, they were unable to see the Polucca place, for it was set in a short distance from the edge of the cliff. The face of the steep rock was uncompromising. There seemed to be no foothold for man or beast. It was just an unscalable, craggy wall. Suddenly, Tony bore down on the wheel. The Napoli swerved swiftly to one side, and at the same time, the engine roared as the craft leaped ahead. Frank and Joe looked quickly around. "What's the matter?" they asked in alarm. But Tony was gazing fixedly ahead. He was tense and alert. Another shift of the wheel, and the Napoli swerved again. Then the Hardy boys saw the danger. There were rocks at the base of the cliff. One of them, black and sharp, like an ugly tooth, jutted out of the water almost immediately at the side of the boat. Only Tony's quick eye had saved them from striking against it. They had blundered into a veritable maze of reefs, which extended for several yards ahead. They held their breath. It seemed impossible that they could run the gauntlet of those rocks without tearing the bottom out of the craft. But Tony's steersmanship was marvelous. The motorboat threaded its way accurately among the jutting rocks. There was always the chance that a submerged reef might rip through the hull of the craft, but they had to take chances on that. But luck was with them. The Napoli dodged the last ugly rock and shot forward into open water. Tony sank back with a sigh of relief. "Whew! That was close!" he exclaimed. "I didn't see those rocks until we were right on top of them. If we'd ever struck one of them, we would have been goners." The Hardy boys believed him. Angry waves dashed against the base of the cliff. They would not have lived more than a few minutes if they had been wrecked in this place. They would have been battered to pieces against the rocks. Suddenly, before them, they saw an opening in the side of the cliff. It was a long, narrow cove. The entrance was like the neck of a bottle, widening as it led into the cliff, and it was overshadowed by jutting rocks. It had been quite invisible up to this time, and the boat had gone only a few yards further before it became invisible again. So well was the opening hidden by the rocks. "Here's a find!" exclaimed Frank in excitement. "Let's turn back and see where this goes to." Tony swung the boat around, and the craft slowly made its way back toward the hidden cove. Soon the opening in the cliff came into view again. "It's just large enough for the boat to go through," said Tony. "Want me to try it?" Frank nodded. "Go ahead." The nose of the boat turned toward this strange bay, and then the Napoli began to enter the cove. "Maybe I won't be able to get out again," said Tony suddenly. He looked ahead, but the passage widened into a bay of considerable extent, quite sufficient in size to enable him to turn the craft around once he had entered. So he continued. But the cove proved uninteresting. The sides were steep, although dense bushes grew about the base of the slopes. But there was no path, no trail, no indication that any human being had ever been in the place. Being protected from the wind, the water was calm. The echoes of the motorboat's engine were flung back from every side in a roaring volume. Suddenly, Frank gave a gasp of surprise. Standing among the thickets at the base of the steepest slope was a man. He was very tall, and he wore a black felt hat, the wide brim of which obscured the upper part of his face. His countenance was tanned and weather-beaten. His lips were thin and cruel. He wore a short black jacket, and he stood with his hands plunged into the side pockets, and his feet spread wide apart. in the manner of a seaman. He was standing there quietly, gazing at them without a shadow of expression on his sinister face, as motionless as a statue. When he saw that he was observed, he called out, "Leave this place!" Tony throttled down the engine. The three boys stared at the man in the black hat, as though he were an apparition. "Leave this place," he repeated, in a curiously metallic voice. "We aren't doing any harm," replied Frank. "Not now," said the stranger. "But don't land here." "Why?" "You don't have to ask why. This is private property. You can't land here. You'd better leave at once." The boys hesitated. As though to emphasize his commands, the man in the black hat reached suddenly into his pocket and whipped out a wicked-looking revolver. Then he folded his arms, tapping the barrel of the revolver against one shoulder very deliberately. "Turn that boat around and get out of here," he snapped. "Don't come back. Don't ever come back. Don't ever try to land here. This is private property. If you ever do land here, you'll be shot." The boys were unarmed. They realized that nothing would be gained by argument. Tony slowly brought the boat around. "Goodbye," shouted Joe cheerfully. The stranger did not reply. He stood there, gazing fixedly after them, his arms still folded, still tapping the revolver against his shoulder as the motorboat made its way out of the strange bay, out into open water. "Looks as if he didn't want us around," remarked Tony, as soon as the Napoli was out of the cove. "I'll say he didn't," exclaimed Frank. "What a wicked-looking customer he was. I expected to see him start popping at us with that gun of his before we got out." "I don't want to run into him again," Joe declared. "He sure gave us our orders, and he meant 'em, too." "I wonder who he is," said Tony. "Do you think, fellows, do you think it could have been Snackly?" shouted Frank. Chapter 15. Smugglers. The thought struck Frank Hardy like a thunderbolt. The appearance of the stranger had been so sinister. He was so evidently a lawless and desperate man who was accustomed to being obeyed, and his presence in this place indicated too clearly that he had some connection with the house on the cliff, that Frank's deduction seemed quite logical. "Snackly!" exclaimed Joe. "It must be him, the head of the smugglers." "I've never seen a picture of Snackly, and I've never heard him described," said Joe, "but that fellow looks just as I had pictured Snackly would look." "He's a leader of some kind. You can tell that by his manner," put in Tony Preto. "He's the fellow who chased Jones that day in the motorboat." "And he'll chase us, too," declared Tony, "if we don't get away from here pretty quick." "Why should we go now?" demanded Frank. "We've stumbled onto something important. That may be the Smuggler's Cove." "But how do they get to the house if you think they have anything to do with the Polucca place?" asked Tony. "Those cliffs in there are mighty steep." "There must be some way that we don't know of. What do you say we hang around here for a while and see what we can do?" Tony became infected with the enthusiasm of the Hardy boys, and he readily agreed to keep the motorboat in the vicinity of the cliff, although it was decided that they should not remain too near, but cruise up and down the shore, in case the sharp-eyed man should be watching them. "It was a good thing we didn't put up an argument with that fellow," said Frank at last. "I'll say it was," Tony agreed emphatically. "We didn't have much chance to argue with that revolver he had. I don't mean that. He may think we were just out for a cruise and accidentally wandered into that cove. If he knew we were hunting for Dad, he might have acted very differently." "That's true, too," said Joe. "Well, we won't go home just yet." It was late in the afternoon. The sky was overcast and twilight was falling. A cold wind blew in from the sea. The motorboat went some distance down the shore, and then they turned and, keeping well out in the bay, went on up past the cliff once again. They kept a sharp eye on the location of the cove, and in spite of the fact that they knew just where it was, they were scarcely able to distinguish the narrow opening in the rocks. "No wonder the place hasn't been heard of more often," Frank said. "It looks like an unbroken wall of rock from out this far." "You've got to be careful around here, Tony," cried Joe. "First thing you know, we'll hit the rocks and be smashed." "That's right," added Frank. "It's pretty dangerous so close to the cliff." "You leave it to me," came from their schoolmate. "I know how to handle this boat." It was true. Tony did know how to handle the motorboat, yet several times they came perilously close to the rocks, over which the waves were dashing. In fact, once there came a slight bump, followed by a grating sound, which made the hearts of all the boys leap into their mouths. "Narrow squeak, that," admitted Tony. "I guess I better keep out a little farther after all." "I certainly should," answered Frank. Although they cruised around for more than an hour, they saw not the slightest sign of life, either about the base of the cliff or on the Polucca place, which, keeping well out from shore as they did, they could plainly distinguish. As the gloom deepened, they felt that it was almost useless to continue, but Frank decided that they should wait just a little while longer. "These fellows aren't likely to move around much in daylight. Night is the time for their operations," he pointed out. "We'll hang around for a while longer." Twilight deepened into darkness, and the lights of Bayport could be seen as a yellow haze through the mist at the distant extremity of the bay. The cliff was but a dark smudge in the night, and the waves broke against the rocks with a lonely sound. Suddenly, through the darkness, they heard a muffled sound. Their own boat was running along quietly, and they listened. "Another boat," remarked Tony in a whisper. It was indeed another motorboat, and it was near the base of the cliff. At last they could distinguish a faint light, and toward this light they began to move slowly. They were tense with excitement. Everything might depend on the events of the next few minutes. When they had gone in toward the cliff as far as they dared, creeping up from the west, they could make out the gloomy outline of the other motorboat, which was making its way slowly out of the very face of the cliff itself. At first they could not imagine how the craft had got in so close, nor where it was coming from. They crept up closer, at imminent danger of discovery, and at imminent danger of being washed ashore on the rocks. Then finally they heard the other boat slow down, heard the faint clatter of oars, then voices. After that, with an abrupt roar that startled them, the other motorboat suddenly plunged out into the bay. They could hear it threshing on its way out toward sea at an ever-increasing rate of speed. "Where's it going?" said Tony in amazement. Frank cautioned for silence. "There's a rowboat around here," he whispered. "Lay low." They waited in silence, and at last they heard the rattle of oars again. This time the sound was closer. The rowboat was drawing nearer. Fortunately, the wind was from the sea, and it blew the sounds toward them, at the same time keeping the men in the boat from hearing the muffled murmur of their own craft. The rattle of oars continued, and at last the boys could see the dim shape of the boat through the gloom. Finally they could distinguish the words of the dark figures in the craft. At a sign from Frank, Tony cut off the engine for the time being. But they could not make out complete sentences. The wind would whisk toward them a fragment of speech, and then the rest of the words would be drowned. 300 pounds, they heard a harsh voice saying, and then the rest of the sentence was lost. A dull murmur of voices. Finally,
I don't know, it's risky.
The wind died for a moment, and then through the gloom the boys saw that the rowboat was headed directly in toward the face of the cliff. It was not many yards away, and as it passed by, they heard the harsh voice again.
Lee Chang's share,
he was saying.
No, we mustn't forget that, they heard a gruff voice reply. I hope they get away all right. What are you worrying about? Of course they'll get away. We've been watched, you know. It's all your imagination. Nobody suspects. Those boys at the house, just kids. If they come nosing around again, we'll knock one of them on the head. I don't like this rough stuff. It's dangerous. We've got to do it or we'll end up in the pen. You can't be white-livered in this game. What's the matter with you tonight? You're nervous. I'm worried. I've got a hunch that we better clear out of here.
Clear out, replied the other contemptuously. Are you crazy?
Why, this place is as safe as a church. We can make a big clean-up before they know we're in this part of the country at all.
Well, maybe you're right, said the first man doubtfully. But still. His voice died away as the boat went on into the cove. The boys could hear the rattle of oars, and then a dull swishing of bushes, a muttered voice, and then silence fell. The boys looked at one another through the gloom. Smugglers! Exclaimed Frank.
Sounds mighty like it, replied Tony. What do you think we should do?
Follow them? Sure, Joe agreed. Follow them right into the cove. But Tony demurred, though as he spoke, he started up the engine again. Count me out, he said. I don't like that talk about being knocked on the head. I may be foolish, but I'm not that foolish. There are 3 of us, and we don't know how many more of them, and they're grown men. I don't want to be trapped in that cove. Besides, the motorboat makes too much noise. They'd hear us coming, and then we'd be done for. This phase of the matter had not occurred to the Hardy boys, but they saw that it was reasonable. In the darkness, it would be risky entering the narrow passage to the cove, and then, as Tony said, it was probable that their approach would be heard. I hate to let 'em get away when we've got such a clue as this, said Frank. There's no doubt they're smugglers. The men in that motorboat probably are going out to a ship for a cargo of smuggled goods, or else they've delivered a cargo and are on their way back. But where on earth did the motorboat come from? Exclaimed Joe. There wasn't any boat in the cove when we were there. Probably well hidden, said Frank. There were a lot of bushes growing close down to the water's edge, I noticed. They'd have some sort of hiding place fixed up. But where did all those men come from? That's what we're going to find out. There must be some connection between this cove and the house on the cliff. I'm going ashore. Somebody's got to stay with the motorboat, said Tony. I'm not afraid to go in there, and if it comes to a dare, I will go, although I don't want to be killed. But we can't leave the boat here, that's certain. I'll tell you what to do, said Frank. Let Joe and me go ashore. Then we'll try to follow those men in the boat and see where they go. If we let them slip out of our hands now, we may lose them altogether. And shall I wait? No, you go back to Bayport and get help, lots of it. The police? The federal men. Tell them we're on the track of the smugglers. If Joe and I discover anything, we'll wait here at the entrance to the cove and put the police on the right track when they get here. Good, said Tony. I'll put you ashore right away. Don't go too close or you'll wreck the boat. Joe, I guess you and I'll have to swim ashore. Then we'll go around into the cove and find out all we can. Tony edged the boat in as close to the gloomy shore as he could, and then, with a whispered farewell, the Hardy boys slipped over the side into the water. They were only a few yards from the rocks, and after a short swim they emerged, dripping, on the mainland. They looked back. They could see the dim shape of the motorboat as it turned away, and then they could hear its dull chugging as Tony Preto turned the craft back in the direction of Bayport. "Now," whispered Frank, "now for the smugglers."
This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we continue to listen to the Hardy Boys in The House on the Cliff. Please let me know of other books that you'd like to hear on this podcast. It's wonderful to hear from you. I'll talk to you again soon.